Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Only last Thursday, as evidence of this rapid offensive buildup was already in my hand, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko told me in my office that he was instructed to make it clear once again, as he said his government had already done, that Soviet assistance to Cuba, and I quote, pursued solely the purpose of contributing to the defense capabilities of Cuba, unquote. That, and I quote him, training by Soviet specialists of Cuban nationals in handling defensive armaments was by no means offensive. And that if it were otherwise, Mr. Gromyko went on, the Soviet government would never become involved in rendering such assistance, unquote. That statement also was false. Acting, therefore, in the defense of our own security and of the entire Western Hemisphere, and under the authority entrusted to me by the Constitution, as endorsed by the resolution of the Congress, I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. I call upon him further to abandon this course of world domination and to join in an historic effort to end the perilous arms race and to transform the history of man. Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved.
It was bitterly cold in Washington, D.C. on January 20th, 1961. At noon, 20,000 people filled the wooden bleachers for John F. Kennedy's inauguration.
You, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
That you will faithfully.
The youngest president since Theodore Roosevelt spoke with passion and hope about the importance of freedom.
My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man. In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger.
Freedom's battleground would be the small island nation of Cuba, lying just 90 miles south of Florida. There, Fidel Castro, a communist leader with Soviet leanings, had seized private property and caused hundreds of thousands of Cubans to flee to America into exile. Kennedy wanted to avoid a confrontation.
The basic issue in Cuba is not one between the United States and Cuba. It is between the Cubans themselves.
Kennedy soon learned that the CIA had been secretly training Cuban refugees to take part in an invasion of the island. The CIA believed that with its help, the Cuban people would rise up and overthrow Castro. Despite doubts, Kennedy gave his go-ahead to the mission. But the invasion at the Bay of Pigs turned into a fiasco. The invaders were captured, the Cuban people didn't rise up, and world opinion came down heavily against the United States and against Kennedy.
This administration intends to be candid about its errors. For as a wise man once said, an error doesn't become a mistake until you refuse to correct it.
Following the Bay of Pigs, the Soviet Union and its partners in Eastern Europe tightened their grip. On August 13th, East German communists began erecting a barricade across Berlin. Any of their people who tried to escape would be shot down by armed guards. The Iron Curtain of communism had become a cement wall with barbed wire.
The first warning comes from Cuba. Refugees
and then in the summer of 1962, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev began secretly importing nuclear missiles to Cuba, where they could be aimed at America's most important cities and military targets. On October 16th, through aerial reconnaissance photographs, President Kennedy learned of the missile sites. Military leaders at the Pentagon urged the president to bomb Cuba, but Kennedy refused, fearing it would lead to nuclear war. Instead, on October 22nd, he called for a quarantine of Cuba, widely reported as an act of war, a blockade. And he ordered the Soviets to remove the missiles.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
It became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. One wrong move could start World War III. As Soviet ships moved toward Cuba to break the American blockade, for 6 tense days, the world held its breath. And then Kennedy's unflinching firmness, combined with delicate behind-the-scenes negotiations, paid off. On October 28th, the Soviet Union agreed to remove all missiles from Cuba and ordered its ships to turn around.
I think President Kennedy had to balance off the defense of freedom against the danger of a nuclear war which would destroy everything. The upshot of it was actually, I think, a greater understanding on the part of both Kennedy and Soviet Premier Khrushchev of the dangers of nuclear warfare, and it led to a more relaxed relationship between the two. Eventually, the ban on nuclear testing and the pulling back from the brink actually was an important step in the survival of the world.
The weapons of war must be abolished before they abolish us.